Okay, welcome everybody to today's program. We are here to talk about the recent agreements that Israel signed with the UAE and Bahrain last week on the White House lawn. I am happy to have two colleagues here who I'll be introducing in just a moment, but really pleased that we have the opportunity to discuss and unpack these events together. As we all know, when these agreements were announced, and then again when they were signed on the White House lawn, they were billed, particularly by the White House and by others, as heralding a new dawn in the Middle East and a new paradigm for peace. We also know that these agreements, while the agreement with the UAE, Israel's agreement with the UAE, did include a suspension of de jure annexation of parts of the West Bank, as had been provided for both under the Trump plan and also under the coalition agreement of the current Israeli government, when Blue and White and Likud formed a coalition together with other parties. While annexation of parts of the West Bank had been included in that agreement, we know that per the agreement between Israel and the UAE, that is supposed to have been suspended. But we also know that that's actually not formally included in the so-called peace treaty that Israel and the UAE signed. So this has been billed, by President Trump and his supporters and some others as well, as heralding a new dawn in the Middle East. We also know that it is something that the Palestinians, both their leadership and also the Palestinian public, has almost overwhelmingly, unifiedly rejected. So that leaves us with the question of where we are. Is this a new paradigm in the Middle East? One in which Arab states are willing to offer Israel normalization for normalization, interest for interest, or peace for peace, if you want to think of it that way, and in which Palestinians and the question of Palestinian statehood and freedom no longer on the broader Arab agenda. What does it mean going forward? What does it mean for Palestinians in terms of their strategy? What does it mean for those of us inside Israel, outside Israel, who care about a two-state solution and about Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state? So we're going to be unpacking all of those questions and some others with a couple of great panelists who I have the pleasure to introduce to you today. So let me start with Bashar Azzeh. Bashar is one of the youngest elected members of the Palestine National Council and the Palestine Central Council. He's a special advisor to the PLO Executive Committee and the PLO Labor and Planning Department. He is also the International Secretary for the PPSF, the Palestine Popular Struggle Front. In addition to that, he is the founder and chairman of Al-Maqdisi Association for Economic and Social Development in East Jerusalem, and the founding owner and chairman of Tatweer Development Group, which is a real estate investment group. Thank you so much, Bashar, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. And in addition, we are pleased as well to have with us Celine Touboul. She is the co-director general and a senior researcher at the Economic Cooperation Foundation, where she also leads the organization's work regarding all policy, economic, and security issues related to the Gaza Strip. Ms. Touboul is a former research fellow at the NATO Defense College. She started her professional training as a lawyer specializing in international law, and she holds law degrees from the University of Paris Sud and also from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Celine, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so our format today will be conversational. It'll be a question and answer opportunity with the panelists. And let me just remind all of our guests that you have the opportunity to ask your own questions of the panelists, which is one of my favorite part of our webinars. The way that you do this is you go to the Q&A box at the bottom of our screen. You can type your question in there any point during the webinar. I will ask, usually we get lots of great questions in the Q&A, and I will pose as many of them to our guests as possible. You can go ahead and put a question into the Q&A at any point during our discussion. So you don't have to wait at any point that something strikes you. Please do feel free to do that. So Bashar, if I may, I would like to start with you, and I'd like to get your thoughts, really centering the question of the Palestinians and the impact of these agreements on the Palestinians at the forefront of our discussion here. Can you share with us your thoughts about the impact of these normalization agreements on the Palestinians? And also talk with us a little bit about the different responses and reactions that you've seen from the Palestinian leadership, different factions, and also from the Palestinian public.
Thank you, Debra, and I'm happy to be on this platform today. This is very interesting times for all of us, as usual. Just to get directly to your point, on the implication part, I see there is 5 major implications that the Palestinians have to face as a result of this deal. One is the usual that everybody's talking about, which is the API, the Arab Peace Initiative. These deals present a break through the unified Arab and Muslim position, because API is not only Arab. The Muslim countries had signed also to the APIs, including countries like Iran. So this normalization deal is actually breaking through the API structure, an API as a unified Arab and Muslim model. And this really weakens the whole position that you have the whole Arab and Muslim countries in the back of the Palestinians, ready to normalize when there is a peaceful agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis. So this break into the API is the major impact that the Palestinians are facing. And to relinquish from this and rebuild from this is not going to be an easy process. It's going to take a while to really come out from the shock and see exactly what is the proper strategy to do. How can you keep API, or how can you move forward with a breakthrough or people who are not respecting API? So this is the #1 challenge and impact on the Palestinians. The second impact is these agreements had complicitly, or they are complicit with occupation, and they ignore reality, meaning that they ignored the reality of occupation, of humiliation, of the daily problems that the Palestinians are facing. And it actually went into what we call more of economic security agreements between 2 nations, ignoring the reality that the Palestinians are living. And this is really affect the Palestinians, who probably and usually thought that the API, normalization with Israel, will bring results to the conflict, meaning that there's a price will be paid by Israel, a peaceful price, a price that's good for Israel and the Palestinians. But the lack of any price or any return to the Palestinians within this agreement is actually emphasizing more on the acceptance of the status quo as the realistic day-to-day approach of what the Palestinians are living in. And it's actually weakening the Palestinian position in explaining that the status quo is dangerous. So this is a very, very important issue. The third issue, it weakened the PLO position in regard to negotiation as the only mean of reaching peace. And it also weakened the PLO position that first, negotiation is going nowhere for the last 20 years. Second, you have a unified Arab position that you have started to lose. And now you are left alone. So the people are questioning the PLO approach toward peace with Israel. The whole concept of peace is being questioned by young Palestinians. Why? If Arabs have given up and everybody's given up, why are you still holding to the negotiation, to the non-violence, to the recognition of the Israeli state? So it's actually have been fracturing the society or what's left in the society who is believing in the 2-state solution and negotiation. And this is a very important issue that we have also to deal with. Now, the fourth issue, which is also a very important fundamental issue, it's these countries are not with direct borders with Israel. This is not Jordan, Egypt, or Syria, or Lebanon. There was no real conflict and threat between those countries and Israel. And reaching an agreement with those countries before the countries who are in line or in conflict today with Israel, such as Lebanon and Syria, showcases that you are really bypassing the conflict. And by bypassing the conflict, you are creating what I call a very shallow gap in the peace process. And this gap is not going to be able to be filled anytime soon if this current policy of reaching out to countries who don't have direct conflict with Israel, while ignoring the ones who are actually in the real conflict. Actually, it exaggerates this conflict and it widens it, especially with countries such as Lebanon and Syria and the Palestinians. So this is also an important issue. And last but not least, the utilization of the theological part in this agreement and the religious theological part is actually a new methodology that we all have to deal with. This is an agreement that was very implicit when it comes to theology. And it really reflected much on the internal Palestinian politics of understanding that today this theology is controlling the approach of peace within the Middle East. And different theologies, not only one theology, because in the end you have the Jewish theology, the Muslim theology, and the Christian theology. But attracting those religious theologies while ignoring the political theories and the political ideology is a mistake. Why? Because you're ignoring all political issues that exist on the ground and you're trying to construct a theological approach to it. And this is also dangerous because you are ignoring everything that exists on the ground. And the Palestinians right now, when it comes to implication on them, they have to deal with this. They have to deal with the point that theological issues has been reflected in those agreements vis-a-vis, let's say, as an example, Al-Aqsa Mosque, or what we call the Haram al-Sharif. The common most trending aspect within the young Palestinians, Arab and mainly Palestinians, is that these agreements have only talked about Al-Aqsa Mosque, ignoring the whole compound. And people are saying that they are dropping the compound and only focusing on Al-Aqsa Mosque, meaning, or changing the status and trying to show that the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the only part of Jerusalem, while the rest of the compound could be utilized by other prayers, either from the Jews, or from the Jewish prayers, Jewish prayers or Christian prayers. What I'm saying, the theological part, that's also very directly connected to Jerusalem, had weakened both, not only the Palestinian, but also the Jordanian part, which is already in agreement with Israel when it comes to leading, or what we call, or the oversighting of the holy sites. This theological part is becoming dangerous because it's ignoring political aspects of it, and its implication is becoming very huge. Now, on your second question, quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, the Palestinians all cross from the right-wing Islamists to the left-wing liberal to the moderate Muslims to Hamas or Fatah or my party, or all PLO factions and non-PLO factions have been unified on their position against this normalization deal. This is one of the first time ever that we see all Palestinian factions unified. And also those who are one-staters, two-staters, all of them, they agree that this is not the right move. And this unification of the Palestinian position is what I call the positive collateral damage of these agreements. And we will talk more later on this issue.
Great, thank you so much, Bashar. What I'd like to do is stay with you for a little bit. Celine, I promise we're gonna come to you because I know you have so much to add to this discussion as well. But I do wanna just stay with Bashar for a moment here. We are, as I knew we would, already getting some great questions in the Q&A, some things that folks would love to hear Bashar expand on. So why don't we do a few of these things? Let's start with the point that you ended with there, Bashar. The issue of Palestinian positioning, and you talked about the kind of positive externalities of this agreement in terms of Palestinians across the spectrum, different factions, Hamas, Fatah, having similar positions. Bill Berger asks if you could talk a little bit more about that and whether you see that there is really a single Palestinian position. And if I may, I would like to also ask if you think, if there really is unity across Palestinian factions, and especially Hamas and Fatah. Is there an opportunity here for this convergence on a single position on these agreements to actually, herald movement toward reconciliation that, of course, we have not seen otherwise in the last several years?
Well, yes, actually, I am a firm believer that this is, so the result of these normalization deals had waken up and shocked the Palestinian leadership, both the leadership of the two major parties here, we talk about Fatah and Hamas, and they both understood, and all the rest of other factions and independents, that the only card that the Palestinians have in their hand today is inner Palestinian reconciliation. And I'm not only talking about Hamas-Fatah reconciliation, I'm talking about PLO reconciliation with other parties who are having problems internally, Hamas and Fatah, people-to-people reconciliation, even between Gaza and the West Bank. So everybody woke up and said, listen, we are running late, we must move into reconciliation. This have been concluded in a first of its time, what we call the head of political factions of the PLO and non-PLO, like Islamic Jihad and Hamas, joining a meeting, virtual meeting, that and they discussed the need to move forward. And this have been also what have been seen lately in the last few days, concluded by a high-level senior meeting between Fatah leaders and Hamas leaders in Turkey. And the main focus of this meeting, as we've been all hearing, is going to be focused on election. How to bring back a Palestinian election of the Legislative Council, which is the parliament, and presidential election. Now, let me just ease your audience before they ask the question. It's very important to understand that when we talk about reconciliation with Hamas, Hamas must become part of the PLO. And the PLO mandate is about negotiation with Israel, recognition of the state of Israel, and nonviolence. And when we bring Hamas as part of the Palestinian political structure into a legislative council or a parliament, those people will abide by the PLO mandate. And that mandate is exactly what we need to bring Hamas under. We are trying to bring Hamas toward nonviolence, toward negotiation. And I believe, as I've been hearing about this meeting in Turkey, that an agreement might be reached between Hamas and Fatah that we should go for election. The president will issue a decree, hopefully soon, announcing that there's going to be election in the next 3 to 6 months. And hopefully we will be able to experience democracy again since 15 years. So yes, there's a positive vibe today in the Palestinian territory between all factions, and young people and everybody, pretty much perception is negative, saying that though they have tried this a million times and it didn't work. But I think we must stay positive, because this is the only card they hold. Now, the only part about this internal reconciliation, there's always a problem. People think that reconciliation will bring the situation to the way it used to be before there was a fight between Hamas and Fatah and the coup in Gaza, or that this reconciliation will make Hamas stronger or Fatah stronger. No, we have to move away from this. And we have to understand, where we have two major parties in the Palestinian political spectrum today, that they have to share this country, this entity. They have to live under one umbrella, under one system, with different ideologies, which is fine. But they must understand that they both can join into a democratic system and move into well, I hope we'll have a state, but move into an entity that they are both under. So the only way for Palestinians to win from this and to come with a positive outcome is through reconciliation. This is a real test for the leadership. The failure in bringing reconciliation is going to be resulting negatively in the streets, and all parts of the leadership will have to pay a heavy price for that.
Okay, thank you for that. On the subject of Palestinian leadership and Palestinian unity, before we move on from that, I do want to ask you, Bashar, about Mohammed Dahlan. We have a question here from Jacob Wirtschafter, who asks about Dahlan, who, of course, as you know, is based in the UAE, is close to the leadership of the UAE. He would like to know if you could answer what role Dahlan might have had in encouraging the UAE-Israel agreement, and if you would comment on the arrest of his supporters in the West Bank by PA security, and how this fits into the wider struggle over a post-Abbas leadership for the Palestinians?
Well, I'm going to answer your last question and drag my answer to your first two parts from the last part. As a Palestinian involved in politics, as a businessman, I want my next leader to be elected. I will not accept any leader to be parachuted on me. Doesn't matter who they are. They are in Ramallah, they are in Gaza, they are in Hebron, they are in Turkey, or they are in Qatar or in UAE. We as Palestinians accept no parachuting. Any next president must be elected democratically by Palestinians. And that person, if it's Dahlan or if it's somebody else, we are open. Election is open and people can come into this election. Mr. Dahlan himself is a Palestinian, but he faces court cases in the West Bank. Now, people say those court cases are illegal or illegitimate. I understand. He can come and fight this within the system. In my opinion, any person who is not under any legal matter should be run for presidency, and then the Palestinians will decide. Now, Dahlan himself, Mr. Dahlan himself, when it comes to his relationship as a UAE resident, as a person who lived there, I think, in my personal opinion, I think it will be ridiculous to believe that a person like Dahlan or anybody other non-Emirati strategic person will advise UAE to go into this deal with Israel. Because I think UAE interests and UAE strategic interests are not being shaped by one person or two people who are not actually even Emiratis. That doesn't mean that Dahlan was not probably involved or not involved. That's something that I don't know personally, nobody's talking about. But assuming that he's their security advisor, definitely they have asked him, that's for sure. But I believe that as all Palestinians have a unified position against this, it doesn't pay Mr. Dahlan any positiveness to be positive about this deal. And if he does, then he doesn't understand the politics of this country, because nobody will accept somebody who's adapting such a non-welcomed deal and coming on a parachute to land in his people. So this is very important. We as Palestinians, and which is very important, we hardly accept leaders from within that being almost non-elected. So how could we accept people who are coming from outside? And just let me just be clear, financially, this issue of people coming with a financial package, Palestinians don't accept this. And I'll give you an example. Mr. Kushner tried this. He came with a package. He went to Bahrain and he said there's billions. And they tried to bring business people to meet with them. It didn't succeed. We understand that our problem is not economy. We will have a strong economy. We as Palestinians can build a very strong economy like Israel, and even better, with coordinating with Israel after we have our state and having our freedom, justice, and dignity and sovereignty. And we know we can do it. So just to conclude on Dahlan, maybe he is an elephant in the room that people are trying to place. I don't see him as an elephant. I think if he's interested to be a Palestinian politician, he can come back, he can face those legal or illegal accusations, and then he's ready. He could be running for any position within the system. That's what we want. We want an elected president. We will not accept somebody who's not elected.
Great, thank you so much for that, Bashar. So Celine, I'd like to turn to you as someone who has been invested and working for a long time, trying to figure out how to bring about a lasting peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. I know you've spent a lot of time thinking and researching about the API, the Arab Peace Initiative, which of course Bashar premised his initial remarks with. I wonder, Celine, if you could give us your thoughts about the Arab Peace Initiative. Do these agreements between UAE and Bahrain herald the end of the API? Is there a way that the API, the concept of Arab states and Muslim states normalizing with Israel in return for Palestinian statehood along 1967 lines with East Jerusalem as a capital and all of that, is there a chance that that could be reshaped a bit, that there could be something like an API 2.0 that could come out of these agreements? Would love to hear your thoughts on all of that, Celine.
Okay, thank you. Well, as you mentioned, the organization that I'm leading has been working for a while now on how to enhance the involvement of key Arab states based on the Arab Peace Initiative, and to leverage the API as an incentive to move towards a resumption of the peace process. Now, obviously, what happened recently constitutes a challenge in that respect. And the question that you're asking is highly relevant to the kind of effort that we have tried to advance. I think that there is no doubt that the Israeli-UAE deal constitutes an important shift in the traditional approach of the API sponsors by enabling a full normalization with Israel before an end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and raise the questions of the relevancy of the API-based approach and the extent to which regional acceptance can still serve as an incentive for reluctant Israeli leaders to move forward. Now, I think that we can make a few observations in that respect. First, the UAE-Israeli agreement preserves somehow a link between regional normalization and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by having brought the Israeli government to suspend for at least 3 years its annexation project. In that sense, I think it does demonstrate the role that Arab players could play in preventing detrimental developments that could have deeply undermined the feasibility of the two-state solution. Now, even though the UAE and Bahrain agreement constitute a departure from the traditional reading, I would say, of the API, I believe that this traditional reading was not really representative of the Arab position way before these agreements were signed. About a decade ago, Saudi counterparts that we were with whom we were talking were willing to agree in private discussion that the API was not take it or leave it document, and that Israeli preservation should be addressed. Also, there was a clear readiness on their side to accept that progress on regional normalization does not have to await the conclusion and implementation of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, but could run in parallel to progress on the Palestinian-Israeli track. Does have a kind of a reinforcing effect. And both principles became public about 6 years ago and repeated since then several times on public seminars and forums. So to come back to your question about whether the API is dead or not, I think that the public position that has been expressed by the Saudis, Morocco, and other members of the Arab League, which have referred to the API framework, says the opposite. Sure enough, it is not clear whether they will continue to stick to that position in the long term, and this uncertainty mostly applies in a way to the younger successors of the current leaders. But I would say that what is dead in my view is that traditional approach that normalization needs to wait for a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And indeed that an update approach of the API should consist in allowing that a gradual normalization process run in parallel to an Israeli-Palestinian track. And in that sense, as I said, this adjustment, I think that there's already a readiness from key Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, to implement it. Granted, obviously, that Israel will move in the right direction. And I think that this is on this basis that the Biden administration should engage and try to leverage the role of the Arab states interested to normalize relations with Israel. Now, to be clear, I don't think that an API-based approach could incentivize an Israeli government that is profoundly opposition. But I think that it could serve as an incentive for an Israeli leader which needs to be encouraged and strengthened internally and domestically in order to make a decision that he generally supports. I think that in the case of Netanyahu, for example, I don't think he was enthusiastic about moving forward the jure annexation. I think he made that call mostly for, domestic electoral reason, but that he was basically looking for a leader to run away from that decision, and that the UAE provided him that later. And I think that similarly, for potential Gantz leader, and I realize that we're not there, who is not opposed to the two-state solution, but will want and need a supportive international and regional platform to move forward, indication that progress will be rewarded by some kind of normalization could be helpful.
Thank you so much for that, Celine. We have a question from Eric Gruen, who would like us to talk about Saudi Arabia, and I think it's very important that we do, and I think it's a natural follow-on to some of the comments that Celine just made. So just a few prefatory words about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, was the originator of the API, the Arab Peace Initiative. I think the Saudis are seen here, and maybe Celine, you could talk a little bit about this, as the key prize, the real, a key player here, and a major prize if the Saudis would join this process behind the UAE and Bahrain. And I think we've seen some contradictory signals from the Saudis about what they intend to do. I mean, on the one hand, you see statements from the Saudis saying that they stand behind the API, right? Of course, what does that mean, along the lines of what you were just talking about? On the other hand, you have King Salman's statement to the UN at the opening of the General Assembly, welcoming these moves by UAE and Bahrain. And just the fact of Bahrain joining the UAE, when Bahrain is, to put it not too tenderly, basically a vassal state of Riyadh, sends its own signal. So Celine, I'd just love to hear your thoughts about what the Saudis are likely to do, whether they might be next, and why, and in what way Saudi Arabia is so important here.
Okay, so first I agree that whether Saudi Arabia will join or not is a key question, because I think that will be the kind of the breaking point of the bigger question of whether we can build on the Arab states to kind of motivate us, Israeli, to move forward and to keep that link between normalization and the Palestinian track, I would say. Now, I think that there is indeed a gap between the current, the king and the crown prince, and I think that the king indeed represents a more traditional approach. My understanding that is still calling the shot on this issue, and therefore I don't necessarily expect that Saudi Arabia will make the decision in the near future, let's say, to follow suit. But indeed, as you said, they are at least publicly been supporting of the UAE decision, and we can assume that they gave a green light to Bahrain, that Bahrain would not have made that decision without a green light from Saudi Arabia. But still, I think that there is big distinction to make between Saudi Arabia giving a green light in private and where it's then publicly. I think that it is a distinction that very much matters. I think also that the fact that Saudi Arabia can still claim the API enables them to remain superior position. As you mentioned, they are kind of the crown jewel for Israel, and they continue to be, and where they stand on that matter very much matter for the Israeli public and the Israeli leaders. Now, even if they wanted to follow the UAE for their own interests, their ownership and attachment to the APIs, I think enabled them to extract more in return, both from the US, but also from Israel in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian track. And therefore, it will not be enough for them in a way that Israel will refrain from doing something in the wrong direction. They will have to do also something positive in the right direction. And I don't expect them to receive less than what the UAE received from Israel in regard to annexation.
Great, thank you so much. So what I'd like to do now is return to the Palestinians, but I'd like to ask a question that on which I'd love to hear from both Bashar and from Celine, and maybe in slightly different permutations here. So we have a question from John Allen, and I'm going to pose this part of it to you, Bashar, which is whether it's time for the Palestinians to work on and put forth their own plan, one that's more detailed than the API. And I just, one of the criticisms that I've heard, I'm sure, many of us have heard, is that the Palestinians have pursued a rejectionist strategy, an empty chair policy, I've heard it called, of not being at the table, not participating. And so, on the one hand, I'd love to hear your response to that criticism, but also this question of whether it is time for the Palestinians to proactively present something beyond the API. And then right after that, Celine, if you could chime in and give us some, or if you could offer some advice to the Palestinians in this new reality, which they might, and they do dislike, but how they might best use it to their advantage moving forward to advance the Palestinian cause, I think it would be really interesting to hear that from you. So Bashar, why don't we start with you?
On this question, it's very important to really understand that the concept of the empty chair is something that's been used to expose the Palestinians' inability to deal with the deal of the century. I firmly believe that even coming with a plan right now by the Palestinians is the wrong strategic step. First of all, there is no platform to come into. And the Palestinian leadership and all across the Palestinian different spectrum, they believe that the current administration and the current deal that they have on the table do not recognize what we call the framework fundamentals that the Palestinians respect vis-a-vis international legitimacy and international resolutions of the UN and so on. So strategically, even today, I'm talking about this time from now to the US election, strategically it doesn't make any sense for the Palestinians to come with any detailed plan. And even if they come with a detailed plan, the US administration will not be interested to even look at it, because it's not about the plans and what you put on the table. It's about the table that you have to sit on. The table does not exist today. The Palestinians don't accept the current framework of a table that the American administration have placed. So bringing out a plan from here or there, it doesn't really help. Now, a Palestinian plan is really needed, a strategic one with details. I agree. I think we have to come out with a detailed plan. Now, to be fair with the Palestinian leadership, they did come out with some plans before. I mean, it does exist on their shelves. And there was no way they went to negotiation without any written plan. But I understand that if there's a change, the Palestinians must come out with a detailed plan to explain exactly what they need. And if you take some parts from what this deal of the century have brought us, there's a map, meaning that people want to see maps. And I think it's time to come out with a Palestinian map of what is the Palestinian state. And that's okay. But currently, strategically today, it wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't even be positive or negative. Just to recall a few points that are really important to understand. The API came as a model for normalization in return for peace. Ending occupation brings normalization. Dealing with the refugee issue bring normalization. Now this whole chemistry have changed, meaning the API is not there in a sense of ability to go for peace in return for normalization. Now there is, I think that American administration, in my opinion, purposefully went into normalization trying to narrow down the conflict toward the Palestinians, meaning that the Palestinians will be left alone in the end. They have said this publicly, and then they have to deal with it. And this is a strategy they're following today. Now, let me just be clear. API or no API, API 2.0 or 3.0, occupation is going nowhere, Palestinians are going nowhere. In the end, we have to deal with the Palestinian question, with the settlements, with the settlers, and so on. This is nothing in the regional dynamics will change the reality on the ground, and whoever have to deal with this soon, in the next administration, the 4 years, or it's the same administration, or a different administration, they have to deal with this issue. So I personally believe that we, even young people, view that the conflict is going nowhere, and we still have to deal with it. And the normalization deals do not really reflect on the reality of how to deal with this issue. So this is a very important way to look at it. Now, on the question of Saudi Arabia, I really heard Celine. I think this is a good analysis to look at it. But let me just go back to a very fundamental point on relationship to how Arabs view normalization. The difference between the leadership and the people is still the same, meaning that the population in the Arab world versus the government is still the same. The people-to-people normalization is not there. To bring this, you need real peace. To bring real peace, you have to end occupation. Otherwise, you will not really gain the people-to-people relationship that we all hope to have, but ending occupation it is. And the best model to look at is the Egyptian and Jordanian model. This have not brought the people-to-people peace. And if people in Israel want only cosmetic peace that's based on political, economic, security, and theology, they can have it, but this is not going to bring the comfort that they're looking for.
Thank you so much for that, Bashar. Celine, over to you.
Well, I think that the Palestinians cannot afford to continue to stand against this normalization agreement, and that the current official Palestinian position is not really sustainable. I very much understand their frustration and anger on what has been happening in the last 4 years, at least. But I very much agree that this cannot stand instead of a strategy, and that they need a plan. And now, by plan, I think that we should explain what we mean here. I think that the Palestinian leadership came out very clearly in regard to its position on the key parameters for an agreement. And it has done so repeatedly, but I don't think that this is a plan. I think a plan is how you get there, how you get to the establishment of a Palestinian state. I think that this is what their European counterparts, which are the most strongly supportive of the two-state solution, are expecting also from them to do, and that this has also caused some frustration between the Europeans and the Palestinian leadership. Now, I think that when we talk about how to get there, also the answer cannot be, let's have a big international conference. This will, in my view, not solve anything in itself. So I think that we need more, some kind of roadmap. Now, to be fair, Israel received a lot of support from the Trump administration in designing a plan. And I think that the Trump plan and vision reflect very much the Israeli vision of the Israeli government vision. Let's make a distinction here. And I don't think that the Palestinian leadership has received the same kind of assistance. And therefore, I think that if we want the Palestinian leadership to put some kind of plan on the table, they should receive all the support they need and require. It will not be the same as having the support of an American president, but if key European leaders decide to work together and engage not only by expressing their frustration and their expectation of a plan, but also to sit around the table with the Palestinian leadership and to help them design that plan, and then to offer the support in materializing it. I think that this will be very helpful. And I'm kind of, I think it should have happened basically before the Trump plan was tabled. And there was a long time warning about the fact that the Trump plan will be published, I think 2 years or so. And I think that it would have been much more constructive, at least for the Palestinians, to do that before, but that's water under the bridge. I don't think it's too late, and I think it will be a constructive thing to do.
Thank you, Celine. Okay, I have 2 questions I want to make sure that we get to in our remaining time. Bashar, there was something that you said very early on in our discussion that I wanted to return to you because it got a lot of reaction in the Q&A. People were really interested in more on this. You talked about the theological approach. I think people are interested in digging in there a little bit. One thing that I think might be helpful for folks, and I'm gonna put a link in the chat, is Danny Seidemann of Terrestrial Jerusalem wrote and kind of parsed out about some language that was in the initial announcement that President Trump had put out about the agreements between Israel and the UAE, and then Israel and Bahrain. Some language about the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, in terms of the ability for all to come and pray freely at all religious sites, including Muslims, and that, you know, that herald, but not limited to Muslims, and that seemed to herald, especially given some specific language about Al-Aqsa, the possibility of a change in the status quo in Jerusalem, and specifically on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. For folks who do want more background, I recommend having a look at that link to dig in some more. But I wonder if our panelists could comment first on what you make of the fact that actually that language that was in Trump's initial declaration did not appear in the actual agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. You know, how much is that a positive thing? Why do you think it didn't appear? And then for Bashar, even though it didn't appear in those agreements, did the Palestinian public get a certain message regarding the status quo? So whoever wants to jump in first, if you'd both like to weigh in on this, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I can start. I really intended to throw the theological part because I think it's a misunderstanding, or let me just be even more clear. I think it's wrong to view the current situation while undermining the theological part that this whole agreements were built upon. And really, in my personal opinion, the main driver behind this fastness of these agreements to come today is actually theological. Now, yes, there is a lot of things in regard to the election in the US, supporting, doing the last minute thing before election, getting popularity and so on. But it sounds like from all the numbers we have seen for Netanyahu, and even from Mr. Trump, it's not really reflecting on these numbers. And this is clearly, in my opinion, the theological part is actually the main driver behind those agreements. And the political security economic parts are what I call the umbrella, or the stick, the carrot that mainly the Arab states needed in order to go into such an agreement. And when you said the statement were theological, but the agreement didn't, it's because the statement were what I call the umbrella. The Abrahamic Accord was the umbrella for this agreement. So there was actually 2 agreements. There was a theological agreement where we, the sons of Abraham, declared that we are 1, 2, 3. And there is a technical agreement between only 2 countries that declared 1, 2, 3. So we have to understand these are 2 separate agreements. One is a declaration of principles of religious theological approach toward this relationship. And the second is a technical, pure state-to-state relationship. Now, what resonated with the Palestinians is the issue of Haram al-Sharif. Clearly, in the Palestinian public perception, is dropping down the Haram al-Sharif and focusing on Al-Aqsa Mosque, meaning this whole compound, which is holy for the Muslims, which is a whole compound, not only Al-Aqsa Mosque that people see, but also the Dome of the Rock, and the property is for Muslims viewed as Al-Aqsa Mosque, not only the physical place where you go and pray. And dropping that sentence mean that you allow for other theologies, which is building the third temple, to be built on that area, which is viewed by Muslim, the Dome of the Rock, as the area where those people want to build the third temple. So it's actually what we call dividing the area of what we call periodic prayers by three religions. This is really what the main concern that is in the Palestinian and the Muslim world today. And another issue that most people ignored is the Jordanian dimension. The status quo on the Haram al-Sharif and the holy sites have been very carefully, delicately managed by the Jordanians. I mean, there's a fine line every day, every second in Jerusalem that could create a whole conflict. And the Jordanians are doing a lot of work, and the Palestinians in Jerusalem, to keep that fine line from being crossed by both sides. And this is also viewed by many people that the Jordanian position on Jerusalem is being conservative to prayers on the temple, on the Haram al-Sharif by non-Muslims, and bringing other Muslim players could open the way for new prayers by Christians, not only Jews. This is the first time we hear about Christians praying. I mean, we talk about Christian evangelists who can pray in the Haram al-Sharif. This is new. And what I'm trying to say here is that this theological approach toward the conflict and theological approach to those agreements is a problematic approach. And only pure political approach, ignoring theology, is also problematic. What we need a political agreement that actually understands theology, but we should not be driven by any side alone. Now, the last point on this, and I know a lot of people are saying, what I'm trying to say also, these people, the theologians behind these agreements, were not the usual theology from the Muslim, the Jewish faith. There was another faith that interfered in their theology of driving these agreements to fulfill their own apocalyptic Armageddon end of day approach to how the return of Jesus will come, or the Messiah on the other side, and so on. And we have to view these approach very carefully and understand how people are viewing these peace for Israel in a way to bring an end of time that will actually bring the Messiah or the Jesus in a different, unique theological way. And I think we have not to undermine this, and hopefully, now just to point on this issue, when we say, are these agreements good in the long term for Palestinians or not? Are these agreements bad? Can Palestinians learn from them? They can build on them. We are open for normalization by the Arab states with Israel if there's an agreement between us and Israel. So the end game for us is acceptable. We're not saying no, but if these agreements have brought something, let's say the UAE brought end of annexation, Bahrain brought East Jerusalem as the capital, Saudi Arabia will bring the Palestinian state, at least if there's something that the Palestinians will get to end their humiliation, end occupation, and bring justice, dignity, and freedom and a state, we might look into it. But these agreements are bringing nothing. And I think this is exactly what the problem is.
Celine, do you have anything that you would like to add on the theological point? I'm going to ask you to keep it kind of brief because I want to make sure we get to one more question before the top of the hour.
No, I would just add that I think that the fact that it was not in the final agreement is a big win. That should be added to the list of what the UAE managed to do, because I think that it got in the statement really by the back door, if I can say, and I'm not convinced that the UAE were fully aware of that small bad paragraph that really meant a violation of the status quo on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, and the fact that they have successfully engage afterward to make sure that this paragraph will not appear in the final agreement was important, and I'm happy that they managed to do it. And I think we should also congratulate Daniel Zalman for having been so strongly engaged on that issue to explain it widely for those who also haven't noticed that little insertion in the statement.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so the question that we'll end with is about the Biden administration. Should there be one starting in January 2021 if Biden is able to defeat Trump in the November election? There was a quote by Nikki Haley, who tweeted on September 17th, right after the signing of the accords between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. She wrote on Twitter that the Israel, UAE, Bahrain normalization agreements were made possible by a concerted strategy adopted by Donald Trump that bypassed the Palestinians, concentrated on Iran, emphasized unapologetic support for the Jewish state, and won the trust of Arab leaders. Now, Biden also welcomed these agreements. Both the Democratic and Republican parties have long welcomed Israeli normalization with Arab and Muslim states. But my question is, should a Biden administration come to power and not have that same interest that the Trump administration clearly does in terms of sidelining the Palestinians, how can the Biden administration engage most productively on this issue? Why don't we turn first to Celine, and then we'll let Bashar, we'll let you have the last word.
Well, my hope is really that the Biden administration, if it was at all to be interested on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is a question mark, but let's hope that they will decide to engage on it, that they will start by early engagement with the Arab states and Jordan, not to kind of try to sideline Egypt and Jordan on the way to Saudi Arabia. I think it's an important point. But also, while they engage with Saudi Arabia, that they try to give them incentive to play a more proactive role, which I think they can play. Now, I think a challenge in that respect will be that Saudi Arabia is concerned of the state of the relation it had with the previous Democrat president, and the policy that was pursued in regard to Iran. And I guess that while having a discussion on their role on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it would be difficult to totally detach that conversation from the Saudi Arabian concern and Israeli concern over Iran, because this also is at the core somehow of some of the Arab states that have decided to normalize, and particularly for Bahrain, and therefore we cannot really make a distinction between these issues and compartmentalize them. So that's my take on it.
I have 2 points to look at. First, we have to understand that the current policy of the U.S. in the Middle East have reshuffled all the cards on the platform, on being a mediator, and so on. So for the Palestinians, the whole game have changed, and the view of the U.S. being the only mediator is over. Doesn't matter, Biden is in power or Trump again is in power. Palestinians do not accept the U.S. as the sole moderator and the sole backbone of any peace or negotiation with Israelis. This is a very important fundamental that the Palestinians have learned their lesson, and I think most likely will not accept a monopoly on the peace process by one single country. This is a very important point that has to be taken. The second point, we have to understand that the Palestinian, let's say the PLO leadership, and here is presented by President Abbas, is very careful on how to deal with the regional aspect of this. We have not seen the presidency or the Palestinian top leadership trying to break the relationship with the Gulf. Yes, there was recalling of ambassadors, but the Palestinians understand, they learned their lessons from the history, that they have to keep the ties with the end. We are all Arabs. And in the end, we have to deal with this issue in a non-emotional way as leaders, as people who have to deal with the Palestinians who live in the Gulf. Today in the United Arab Emirates, there's 100,000 plus Palestinians in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia. And we have to understand that the Palestinians are not only in the West Bank and Gaza. So the Palestinian leadership is carefully crafting the issue regionally. Now, this takes me to the second point, which is what will happen if Biden administration comes in. I think for any US administration that comes in after election, have to reinstate the relationship with the Palestinians, have to rebuild the relationship with the Palestinians. The current Palestinian-US relationship is back to zero. And what we need is to reconstruct this relationship. And I'm talking here about what I call a direct Palestinian-American relationship, a bilateral relationship, not tied to the peace process and not tied to Israel. This is a very important thing that we Palestinians have to do and the new administration have to do, is to bring this relationship back. And second is to really go back into the track of negotiation, pushing for elements to bring the two sides together. And you could utilize, yes, you could utilize these agreements at that time and saying, listen, those Arab states who normalized might be able to pressure at that time through this relationship on Israelis to say, listen, now you really have to come into the table. So, I mean, taking these agreements in an era of today wouldn't be different in the era of who is in the White House and after the election. This is a very important issue. The whole concept of what's going on today in the Middle East and the agreements and the affiliations will have to be viewed differently after the US election, because the approach by Democrats are different than the approach of Republicans. But let's just be clear about one thing. I do not believe there's going to be an Iran issue with this current administration. Trump publicly have said he wants to make a deal with Iran, and it's his own deal. I believe in the theological approach to the conflict, to bring peace to Israel, to fulfill theological needs. There should be no enemies to the state of Israel. Now, cosmetically or non-cosmetically, that's a different approach. I believe if this administration will have a second term, you will see there's no axis in the Middle East. There's no axis of moderation, an axis of resistance, an axis of Iran. There's going to be one axis. All those countries must have some kind of relationship with Israel in order to fulfill this also theological part. And this is very important to understand. Now, if there's a new administration that is different, might have to think that, yes, we have to move into steps to bring no more enemies. Yes, we have seen Obama administration building an Iran agreement. This is a good model. It has to be rebuilt again. And actually the same model could be used by Palestinians. This is my last point. Maybe a model of 5+ is the right model to approach the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, similar to what Iran engaged. Let's engage everybody in. Let's engage Saudi Arabia. Let's engage Russia. Let's engage everybody in this agreement. I think a 5+ model, 5+5, 5+10, bringing all the Arabs in order to show Israel their seriousness, is a good model to view in the near future.
Thank you so much for that. Well, there's obviously a lot more that we could talk about on the topic of these agreements. Obviously, we have the question of F-35s, which is going to be a live issue in terms of possible F-35 sales to the UAE, vis-a-vis Congress's position, the administration's position, Israel's position. But I'm really happy that today we were able to center the Palestinian issue and what these agreements mean for the possibility of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement down the line, what they mean for the Arab Peace Initiative, et cetera. So I really want to thank our two wonderful guests, Celine Touboul, Bashar Azzeh. I want to thank our audience and your great questions that you shared. And that's going to conclude today's webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.